Growing up in a town like Harmony Creek, you learn that quiet doesn't always mean peaceful. It's the kind of place where the silence has weight, where secrets are currency, and every drawn curtain feels like a statement. Our street, a sleepy lane of near-identical houses shaded by ancient, gossiping oaks, was the epicenter of this stifling tranquility. My family's home, with its cheerful white picket fence and slightly overgrown lawn, was a study in comfortable imperfection. It was real. Then there was the house next door. It wasn't just a house, it was an anomaly. While our homes aged with a certain grace, showing their years in faded paint and settled foundations, the Collinses' house was a monument to sterile newness. It was too big, its lines too sharp, its windows too clean. It stared out at the rest of us like a judge. The man of that house, Mr. Collins, was as much an enigma as his property. He was a specter in expensive suits, a man who moved through our world without ever seeming to touch it. His wealth was a given, whispered about but never confirmed, a silent testament to some far-off important life we couldn't comprehend. He had a wife, the lovely and radiant Mrs. Collins, and a daughter, 2-year-old Stacy, whose laughter was one of the few sounds that ever seemed to escape their pristine yard. But Mr. Collins's true passion, the object of his unwavering, almost religious devotion, was his car. It was a sleek, black sports car, a panther of polished chrome and dark glass that looked as out of place on our humble street as a spaceship. Every Saturday and Sunday, without fail, he would be out there with it. It wasn't just washing, it was a ritual. He had a whole arsenal of cloths, waxes, and mysterious little bottles. He would spend hours, his brow furrowed in concentration, polishing every inch until the vehicle gleamed with an unnatural perfection, reflecting the world back in a distorted, flawless image. I would watch from my bedroom window, a kid fascinated by this bizarre display of affection. Why would a man love a machine so much? It seemed to me he spent more time caressing the fenders of that car than he ever did holding his wife's hand. Mrs. Collins was his perfect opposite. She was the warmth to his cold, the color to his monochrome existence. She'd wave to me with a genuine bright smile as she pushed Stacy in her stroller, her presence a little pocket of sunshine on our otherwise muted street. Sometimes, she'd stop by our fence, her voice a soft melody as she asked about my day at school, or offered me one of her still warm chocolate chip cookies, the best I've ever tasted. Stacy was a cherub, all giggles and clumsy, toddling steps. Seeing mother and daughter together in their yard, a splash of life against the backdrop of that sterile house, was a comforting, reassuring sight. They were the human element, the proof that a heart beat somewhere within those immaculate walls. Then the warmth vanished. One Tuesday, the sunshine was gone. Mrs. Collins and Stacy were simply not there. It was as if a celestial hand had reached down and plucked them from our world, leaving behind a void that was colder and more absolute than Mr. Collins's usual demeanor. I remember the day with a stark clarity that time has failed to dull. The police car, its presence a jarring slash of official blue against the neighborhood's placid greens and browns, pulled up to our curb. 2 officers, their faces grim and professional, came to our door. They asked if we had seen Mrs. Collins or the little girl. Mr. Collins had reported them missing. The official story, the one he gave with a face as smooth and unreadable as his car's waxed hood, was that his wife had left him, packed a bag, took their daughter, and disappeared into the night. My parents were flabbergasted, their shock echoing the quiet confusion that rippled through the town. We couldn't offer any help. We hadn't heard an argument, hadn't seen a taxi, or a strange car. We had seen nothing. Weeks bled into months. The initial shock curdled into a thick soup of rumor and speculation. Harmony Creek feasted on the mystery. Mrs. Collins had a secret lover in the city. She'd run off to join a commune. She'd won the lottery and left her cold fish of a husband behind. But darker whispers slithered beneath the surface, spoken in hushed tones over garden fences and in the checkout line at the grocery store. They were whispers of a rage hidden behind a placid mask, of a darkness lurking in that spotless house. I tried to ignore it all, to be a kid who cared more about summer vacation than neighborhood tragedies, but I couldn't. Every time I looked out my window and saw Mr. Collins, back at his ritual, polishing that black car, a profound sense of wrongness would wash over me. The act no longer seemed obsessive. It seemed like an erasure. It was as if he were trying to buff out a terrible stain, a memory that only he could see, scrubbing away at the metal until it reflected nothing but his own empty face. The first crack in his story appeared a few months after they vanished. My dad was in our garage, a sanctuary of sawdust and grease, where he tinkered with his old pickup truck. He called my mom and me over, his voice low and urgent. He pointed across the driveway. Mr. Collins's garage door was open just a crack, a sliver of darkness, and inside, barely visible but unmistakable, was Mrs. Collins's white Jeep. It was her car, her symbol of independence, the one she used for groceries and trips to the park. Now, it sat under a thick, funereal shroud of dust, its tires looking soft and defeated. It hadn't moved in months. My dad's question hung in the stale air of our own garage, heavy and terrible. If she ran away, why in God's name would she leave her car? We all stared, The three of us, a silent jury witnessing a piece of evidence that screamed a silent accusation. A few days later, the Jeep was gone, vanished as completely as its owner. We assumed Mr. Collins had sold it. Another piece of his past scrubbed away. His behavior grew stranger, more erratic. He was a man coming undone at the seams. He rarely went outside anymore, and when he did, his movements were furtive, jerky. He was constantly glancing over his shoulder, his eyes darting around as if expecting an ambush. The black sports car, his former idol, began to gather its own layer of dust. His yard, once a carpet of manicured perfection, grew weedy and unkempt. The house itself seemed to be sinking into a state of neglect, mirroring the decay of the man inside. The night it all culminated is burned into my memory like a brand. We were at the dinner table, the familiar clatter of cutlery, a comforting, domestic soundscape, when a deafening crash shattered the evening quiet. It came from the Collins house. It wasn't the sound of something dropped. It was violent, destructive. My dad, ever the protector, grabbed a heavy maglite from the kitchen drawer. "Stay here," he commanded, his face set in grim lines. My mum and I rushed to the living room window. Our own dinners forgotten, we watched Dad's silhouette cross the lawn, the beam of his flashlight cutting a nervous path through the darkness. He knocked on Mr. Collins's front door. An eternity seemed to pass before the door creaked open, spilling a sliver of sickly yellow light onto the porch. Mr. Collins stood there, a ghost in his own home. He was pale, his skin looking waxy and translucent, his eyes wide with a frantic, cornered animal terror. Dad asked if everything was all right. Mr. Collins just gave a single, jerky nod, mumbling something about dropping a heavy box before shutting the door abruptly. When my dad came back inside, his face was pale, his usual calm completely gone. He was visibly shaken. "I saw something," he said, his voice barely a whisper. When he opened the door, I could see into the kitchen. He described the scene in disjointed fragments. On the stove, a huge industrial-sized pot was boiling, a thick, acrid-smelling steam rising from it. And on the kitchen counter, lying next to a cutting board, was a handgun. But it was the pot that had horrified him. He couldn't explain why, but the sight of that boiling vat, combined with the gun and the look on Collins's face, had filled him with a primal gut dread. He said it smelled sweet, but in a horrible, chemical way. Years have passed. I'm an adult now, with a life and a home far from Harmony Creek, but the ghosts of that street still follow me. The mystery of Mrs. Collins and little Stacy was never solved. Mr. Collins sold the house a year after that night and simply disappeared himself. No one knows where he went. The case is cold, a forgotten file in a dusty cabinet, but I haven't forgotten. Sometimes, late at night when the house is still and the world outside is hushed, the images come back. The dusty white Jeep, the frantic, haunted look in Mr. Collins's eyes, the chilling sight of his gleaming black car, a polished tombstone on wheels, and my father's horrified whisper about what he saw in the kitchen. I think about that huge, boiling pot and the sweet, chemical smell. My mind, now older and more aware of the world's darkness, fills in the blanks with possibilities so grotesque I have to force them away. I'll never know for sure what happened to them, but I no longer hope they are safe somewhere. I fear I know exactly where they went. I fear they were scrubbed away, polished out of existence, and all that remains is the faint, acrid memory of a man trying to erase a stain that could never be washed away. The city at night is a different beast. By day, it's a chaotic symphony of traffic and people, but after midnight, it becomes a sprawling, lonely landscape of shadows and secrets. For the past few months, this had been my world. As a food delivery driver, I was a nocturnal navigator, a purveyor of late-night cravings, and my beat-up sedan was my trusty, if slightly pathetic, steed. Most nights were a blur of repetition. Get the ping, pick up the greasy bag of comfort food, follow the serene, disembodied voice of the GPS, drop it off, and repeat. It was monotonous, mind-numbing work, but it paid the bills. This night, however, started with a subtle but distinct shift in the routine. A discordant note in the familiar song. It was well past midnight, creeping toward the hour when the city finally gives up and goes to sleep. I was about to call it a night when one last order came through. The pay was good, too good for the estimated distance, which should have been my first red flag. The destination was a part of town I'd never even heard of, a neighborhood that didn't appear on the mental map I'd so carefully built over hundreds of deliveries. No problem, I thought, that's what the GPS is for. The app's familiar blue line led me off the main artery of the city, away from the comforting glow of streetlights and familiar landmarks. I was soon plunged into a warren of residential streets that felt less like a neighborhood and more like a deliberate trap. The houses grew sparse, set far back from the road, separated by unnerving patches of darkness. The streets themselves began to defy logic. They twisted and coiled back on themselves, turning at impossible angles. Every corner I took seemed to lead me deeper into an identical-looking street, creating a profound sense of dislocation. The streetlights became a distant memory, replaced by the occasional flicker of a lone porch light. casting long, distorted shadows that writhed like living things. My GPS began to falter. The calm, confident voice started to sound confused, rerouting me constantly. "Make a U-turn," it would command, seconds after telling me to turn right. It was as if the very geography of the place was actively resisting me, the streets rearranging themselves just out of sight. A cold knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. This wasn't just an unfamiliar area. It felt fundamentally wrong, like a glitch in reality. But the job was the job. A customer was waiting. After what felt like an hour of navigating this disorienting maze, the GPS finally declared, in a tone of weary triumph, "You have arrived." I slowed my car to a crawl and peered into the oppressive darkness. The house stood at the dead end of a cul-de-sac, a skeletal silhouette against a starless sky. It was a tall, narrow structure, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, its windows dark and vacant like the eyes of a skull. The lawn was a jungle of knee-high weeds. It didn't just look empty, it looked forsaken, a place where hope had come to die. My hand hovered over the gear shift. Every instinct screamed at me to put the car in reverse, to flee this wrong place and never look back. I could cancel the order, take the hit to my rating. But then I pictured the customer, hungry, waiting. Maybe it was an old house, inhabited by an elderly person who couldn't keep up with repairs. I was a professional. I had to see it through. I killed the engine, and the sudden silence was immense, deafening. I got out of the car, the bag of food feeling flimsy and absurd in my hand. The air was thick, heavy, and still, carrying a faint, musty scent of decay. As I walked up the cracked gravel path, every crunch of my footsteps sounded like a gunshot. In the dead quiet, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. A physical pressure on the back of my neck. I scanned the dark windows of the neighboring houses, but there was nothing, just black, empty squares. When I reached the dilapidated porch, I saw that the front door was ajar, hanging open by a few inches. It creaked as if inviting me into the abyss that lay beyond. "Hello, food delivery," I called out, my voice sounding thin and shaky. It was swallowed by the house, leaving only a dead silence in its wake. There was no answer, just the echo of my own fear. Something deep within, my primal brain, the part that knows when a predator is near, was screaming, "Run, drop the food and run." But a stupid, stubborn sense of duty pushed me forward. I nudged the door with my foot and peered into the impenetrable blackness of the hallway. I could see nothing, just a void that seemed to suck all the light from the porch. That's when I heard it, not a voice, but a sound, a soft, dry rustling from the side of the yard, like dead leaves being dragged across concrete. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, and I saw them. They emerged from the spaces between the houses, from the deep shadows under the trees, materializing from the darkness as if they were made of it. Figures, moving with an unnatural, silent grace, gliding over the overgrown lawn without making a sound. My blood ran cold. My breath hitched in my chest. They were closing in, forming a loose, silent perimeter. The first one stepped onto the porch, into the weak spill of light from a distant flickering street lamp, and I saw the mask. It was a blank, white porcelain face, utterly devoid of features. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth, cold, emotionless oval. Then the others followed, a small crowd of them, all wearing the same horrifyingly vacant masks. They surrounded me on the porch, their silent presence more terrifying than any scream. I was trapped, my back pressed against the splintered wood of the porch railing. I tried to speak, to ask what they wanted, but my throat had seized up. My mind was a maelstrom of terror, a frantic search for an escape that didn't exist. One of them reached for me. I flinched violently, dropping the bag of food. It hit the porch with a dull thud. Its hand was as cold as a morgue slab as it clamped onto my arm. Another grabbed my other arm. They were impossibly strong. They didn't speak, didn't make a sound. There was only the sound of my own ragged breathing as they began to pull me, dragging me toward the open black moor of the house. I struggled. I kicked. I tried to wrench myself free, but it was useless. Their grip was like iron. The more I fought, the tighter they held. They dragged me over the threshold, and the front door slammed shut behind us with a deafening boom, plunging us into absolute, suffocating darkness. I was blind, adrift in a sensory deprivation tank of terror. My other senses screamed to life. I could hear their soft, purposeful footsteps on the floorboards all around me. I could feel their cold, probing hands moving over my body, searching my pockets with a chilling efficiency. They took my wallet. They took my phone. They took my car keys. I wanted to scream for help, to let out the terror that was building inside me like a pressure cooker. But the sound was strangled in my throat, as if the darkness itself had a physical presence and was choking me. My mind spun, trying to find a rational explanation. A robbery. But this was too strange, too ritualistic. Nothing made sense. Finally, after stripping me of every personal possession, they let go. I collapsed onto the floor, a trembling, sobbing heap. I heard their footsteps, moving away, the creak of the front door opening and closing again. And then, silence. The same profound, dead silence as before. Only now I was on the inside. I lay there on that filthy floor for what felt like a lifetime, too paralyzed by fear to move. The events replayed in my mind on a terrifying loop: the maze-like streets, the abandoned house, the gliding figures, the blank white masks. It felt like I had stumbled into a tear in the fabric of the world and fallen into a nightmare. Eventually, the adrenaline gave way to a desperate need to escape. I pushed myself up, my legs shaking uncontrollably. I fumbled my way through the darkness, my hands outstretched, until I found the doorknob. I pushed the door open and stumbled back out into the night. The street was empty. The masked figures were gone, as if they had dissolved back into the shadows from which they came. My car was still there, parked at the curb, untouched, a silent monument to the normality that had been shattered. I had been robbed, yes, but they had taken more than my wallet and my phone. They had taken my sense of safety, my belief in a rational world. They had left me with a chilling, indelible truth that there are places where the streets change, where the rules don't apply, and where silent, faceless things wait in the dark for the next delivery. I got in my car and drove, my hands shaking, so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I didn't look back. I just drove, trying to outrun the memory of those blank white masks, knowing, with a certainty that chilled me to my very soul, that no matter how far I went, I would never truly escape the labyrinth. The basement of St. Jude's Hospital was a world unto itself, a subterranean kingdom of humming machinery, winding corridors, and the pervasive sterile scent of bleach that never quite managed to mask the underlying odor of sickness and decay. As a night shift orderly, this was my domain. While the upper floors dealt with the messy business of life and death, my job was about the quiet aftermath. The long silent hours were spent in a small, windowless office, a dimly lit sanctuary of cracked linoleum and peeling paint. The only thing that made the nights bearable was my co-worker, Dave, a man whose cynical humor was the only antidote to the oppressive quiet. Our office had one unfortunate feature. It was right next to the morgue. A heavy steel door separated us from the hospital's final residents, a door I tried my best to ignore. That night was creeping along at a glacial pace. It was a little after midnight, the time when the hospital settles into a deep, eerie hush, broken only by the distant, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor or the soft squeak of a nurse's shoes down a far-off hall. Dave and I were killing time, trading bad jokes and speculating about the lives of the doctors and nurses upstairs. The air in our little office was thick and stagnant, the buzzing of the single fluorescent light fixture a monotonous drone. It was a night like any other, until the footsteps had heard them first. They weren't the hurried, purposeful steps of a doctor on call or the tired shuffle of a nurse ending her shift. These were slow, measured, and deliberate. Deliberately quiet. The sound was unnerving in the profound silence. Dave and I both fell silent, our eyes turning to the open doorway. A man walked past, his head turning just enough for his eyes to flick toward us, taking in the scene in our little office before he continued down the hall toward the morgue. There was something furtive and unsettling in that brief glance. He didn't belong. He wasn't staff. He wasn't visiting clergy. He wasn't law enforcement. I felt a prickle of unease, a cold tendril of dread snaking up my spine. A minute later, he was back. This time he stopped, lingering in the doorway, a tall, gaunt figure silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor. He had a pale, almost waxy complexion, and his eyes were wide and dark, sunk deep into their sockets as if he hadn't slept in a year. His clothes were strangely formal for the middle of the night, a dark, slightly too large suit that looked like it belonged to another era. He looked like an undertaker from a forgotten black and white film. He just stood there, staring at us, and the silence in the room became charged, electric with unspoken tension. "Do you have access to the morgue?" he asked. His voice was a low, dry rasp, like stones grinding together. I exchanged a cautious look. With Dave, we'd had pickups from funeral homes at all hours, though it was unusual for them to come without calling ahead. It was the only logical explanation. "Yes," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Are you here for a pickup?" The man's expression didn't flicker. A normal person would have produced paperwork, mentioned a name. He did none of those things. A strange, unnerving glint appeared in his dark eyes, a flicker of something that looked like desperate hunger. He took a half step into the room, his presence feeling like a sudden drop in temperature. He stared at me, then at Dave, as if weighing us, assessing our moral fiber. Then he said the words that ripped the ordinary fabric of the night to shreds. "I'll pay you," he rasped, his eyes locking onto mine. $200, cash, just to let me in for an hour. I need to be alone with the bodies." The words hung in the sterile air, obscene and monstrous. A wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. I looked at Dave. His face was a mask of slack-jawed disbelief, his usual jaded smirk completely gone. Who was this man? What kind of sickness? What kind of depraved desire would lead someone to make such a request? My mind recoiled from the possibilities, but they flooded in any way, each one more grotesque than the last. The man seemed oblivious to our revulsion. His gaze was intense, pleading, yet predatory. He was like a starving man staring at a feast. The air in the tiny office felt thick enough to choke on. This wasn't just a weirdo. This was something dangerous. This was a glimpse into a darkness I had never known existed. My voice, when I found it, was shaky but firm. "We can't do that. It's against hospital policy." I was proud of how steady I sounded, how professional. Inside, my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. For a moment, the man's expression hardened. His pale face darkened, and the muscles in his jaw clenched. I saw a flash of raw fury in his eyes, and I braced myself for an argument, for threats, for some kind of outburst. But then, just as quickly as it appeared, the anger subsided, replaced by a cold, reptilian calculation. He seemed to understand that we were not going to be bought. He gave us one last, long, unblinking stare, a look that felt like he was memorizing our faces, and then he turned without another word. His slow, deliberate footsteps echoed down the hallway, fading into the hospital's oppressive silence. Dave and I sat there, stunned, the space where he had stood still feeling cold. The silence he left behind was heavier, more menacing than before. "What the hell was that?" Dave finally breathed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We need to tell security," I said, my mind finally kicking back into gear. We scrambled out of the office and hurried through the labyrinthine basement corridors, every shadow now seeming to hold a threat. The familiar, sterile environment of the hospital suddenly felt hostile, alien. Found the main security office on the ground floor, the guard on duty looking bored behind his bank of monitors. We tumbled out our story, describing the gaunt man, the old-fashioned suit, and his horrifying request as we spoke. The guard's expression shifted from boredom to sharp, sudden interest. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "Wait a minute," he said, holding up a hand. "Describe him again." We did. Pale, waxy skin, sunken eyes, old suit. We nodded, and he asked to be alone in the morgue. "He offered us money," Dave added. The guard let out a long, weary sigh and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face. "Him. We've had calls about him for the past couple of months. Always the same area, always the same time of night. By the time we get a patrol down there, he's vanished, like a ghost." He shook his head. "We don't know who he is or how he gets in, but he's always sniffing around the morgue." The idea that this ghoul had been haunting the hospital for months, slipping through the cracks, made the whole incident even more terrifying. What did he want? The question hammered at my brain, conjuring images I desperately wanted to erase. Necrophilia was the obvious, horrifying answer, but the look in his eyes, it felt like something more than that. It felt like a need, a hunger, that was ancient and unholy. The guard promised to dispatch a patrol immediately, but I knew it was useless. The man was gone. Returning to our basement office felt like descending back into the lion's den. The steel door to the morgue now seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had come face to face with a monster, a creature that fed on death itself. For the rest of the shift, every creak and groan of the old hospital made me jump. I quit that job a week later. I couldn't handle it. I couldn't walk past that steel door without thinking of the man with the hungry eyes. But the story doesn't end there. About a month after I left, I ran into Dave at a coffee shop. He looked terrible, haunted. He told me that a few days after our encounter, a new hire, a young kid working the night shift alone, had been found in the basement. He wasn't physically harmed, but he was catatonic, staring at the wall, unable to speak. The heavy steel door to the morgue was found unlocked and slightly ajar. Nothing was officially reported as disturbed. No bodies were missing or visibly tampered with. But the kid, they said, just kept whispering the same two words over and over again. "He's empty. He's empty." I never found out what he meant, but I have my own terrifying theory. The man wasn't there to do something to the dead. He was there to take something from them, something to fill a void in himself that was ancient, bottomless, and utterly inhuman. The Pine Barrens of New Jersey are a place out of time. It's a vast, sprawling wilderness of sand, cedar water, and unnervingly straight pine trees that stand like silent sentinels over a million acres of secrets. People say the place is haunted, not just by the ghosts of its industrial past, but by something older, something that has been there since before the first settlers arrived. In 2019, when I was 13, my dad decided it was the perfect place for a night hunt. He was a man who believed the woods could teach a boy everything he needed to know about life and death. That night I learned more than he ever intended. We'd been to the Barrens before on day trips, but this was different. This was an immersion into its nocturnal heart. We arrived just as the sun was beginning to bleed out across the horizon, painting the sky in lurid shades of orange and purple. The air was already growing heavy and cool, thick with the sharp, clean scent of pine and the damp, loamy smell of the forest floor. The silence was immediate and profound. The usual symphony of birdsong was gone, replaced by a quiet so deep it felt like a pressure against my eardrums. My dad, a seasoned hunter, was in his element, but I felt a nascent tremor of anxiety. The trees seemed to crowd closer as the light failed, their shadows stretching into long, grasping fingers. We walked for what felt like miles, deeper and deeper into the forest, leaving the familiar world behind. Dad carried his heavy caliber rifle with a practiced ease. I clutched the smaller .22 he'd given me for my birthday. The cold steel, a small, inadequate comfort against my chest. The moon was a pale sliver, offering little light through the dense canopy above. Our world was reduced to the bobbing cones of our flashlights, cutting feeble paths through the oppressive dark. Every so often, Dad would stop, holding up a hand for silence, crouching to read some imperceptible sign in the dirt. But the woods were unnervingly still. There were no snapping twigs to signal a deer, no rustling in the underbrush from a fox. It was as if every living creature was holding its breath, hiding from something unseen. After an hour, my legs ached and a chill had settled deep into my bones. Sensing my fatigue, Dad suggested we rest. We found a small, natural clearing and sat on a fallen log, the damp bark seeping through my jeans. The silence pressed in, amplifying the sound of my own anxious heartbeat. Dad whispered something about patience being the hunter's greatest virtue, but his voice sounded strained, his usual confidence muted by the overwhelming quiet. We were intruders here, and the forest knew it. That's when the silence broke. It wasn't a sound I recognized from any nature documentary. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate up from the ground itself. It was deep, resonant, and filled with a raw, primal menace. My head snapped up. I looked at my dad. His face, illuminated in the ghostly glow of our flashlights, was pale, his eyes wide and fixed on the impenetrable wall of trees in front of us. He slowly, silently, reached for his rifle, his knuckles white. He motioned for me to do the same. The growl came again, closer this time, and from a slightly different direction. It echoed through the pines, a sound that bypassed the ears, and settled directly in the pit of my stomach. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood on end. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep a grip on my rifle. This was no bear or wild dog. This was something else. Something wrong. My dad stood up, a slow, fluid movement, born of years in the woods. He didn't make a sound, but I could see the rigid terror in his posture. He was the bravest man I knew, and he was terrified. That scared me more than the growl itself. Then, a shape detached itself from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly so, its form hunched and gaunt. It was hard to make out details in the shifting darkness, but it had the general shape of a canine, yet it stood on two long, spindly legs. Its head was long and equine, and from the darkness of its face, 2 points of faint, yellow light glowed. With a sickening intensity, it wasn't reflecting our light. It was generating its own. The growling intensified, a wet, ragged sound that promised violence. I could see its breath misting in the cold air, and as it curled its lips back, I saw rows of long, needle-like teeth. My dad whispered my name, a single, sharp command to stay still, but my legs had turned to stone. I was paralyzed, a rabbit. In the gaze of a python, the creature began to circle our small clearing, moving with a horrifying loping gait. It would melt into the shadows, disappearing completely, only to re-emerge moments later from a different spot, its glowing eyes, never leaving us. It was hunting us. It was playing with us. My dad raised his rifle, the barrel trembling slightly as he tried to track the creature's movements. But he didn't shoot. It was a subconscious understanding that passed between us in that moment of shared terror. A bullet wouldn't stop this thing. A bullet would only make it angry. Then the creature threw its head back and unleashed a sound that shattered the world. It was a howl, but it was also a scream, a high-pitched banshee-like shriek of pure agony and rage that tore through the forest and seemed to shake the very ground we stood on. That sound broke the spell. Dad grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. "Run," he screamed, his voice cracking. And we ran. We plunged blindly into the darkness, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping at our faces and arms. I could hear Dad right behind me, his ragged breaths mingling with my own panicked sobs. Behind us, the creature's growls and occasional shrieks echoed through the trees, sometimes sounding terrifyingly close. My lungs burned, my legs were numb. The forest was a disorienting, terrifying maze. We weren't following a path, we were just fleeing, driven by pure primal fear. After what felt like an eternity of crashing through the wilderness, we finally dared to stop, collapsing against the rough bark of a pine tree, gasping for air. The woods had fallen silent again, but this new silence was worse. It was an expectant silence. The silence of a predator that knows it has its prey cornered. "We have to keep moving," Dad gasped, but we were hopelessly lost. Every direction looked the same, an endless, black expanse of pine trees. My flashlight beam was starting to flicker and fade, and the thought of being left in this place in total darkness was a new kind of terror. Just as I was about to give in to despair, Dad stumbled upon it, one of the faint sandy trails that crisscrossed the barrens. It was barely a path, but it was something man-made, a link back to the world we had left behind. With a renewed surge of hope, we followed it, running and walking in turns, constantly looking over our shoulders, listening for that terrible howl. When the familiar shape of our truck finally appeared in the faint moonlight, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees washed over me. We scrambled inside, locking the doors, the sound of the locks clicking into place the most comforting sound I had ever heard. Dad started the engine and we sped away, leaving the Pine Barrens and its dark heart behind us. We didn't speak a single word on the long drive home. There was nothing to say. We had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back with glowing yellow eyes. I never went hunting again. The memory of that night is a scar on my soul. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I can still hear that howl on the edge of the wind, a reminder of the ancient things that walk in the dark places of the world. But the most terrifying part came a week later. My dad was cleaning his rifle, and he called me into the garage. He pointed to a series of long, deep gouges in the metal of the barrel, near the muzzle. "Look at this," he said, his voice low and trembling. I didn't hit anything. Nothing hit me. They were claw marks, deep, sharp, and perfectly spaced. The creature had been close enough to touch us. It had let us go, and that is a thought more terrifying than any chase. For the better part of a year, the graveyard shift at the gas and go on the edge of town had been my life. It was a lonely outpost, the last flicker of civilization before the highway plunged into miles of dark, empty countryside. Most nights were a study in profound boredom. I'd watch the clock, restock the beef jerky, and serve the occasional long-haul trucker or bleary-eyed traveler. It was a quiet, predictable existence, and I'd grown complacent in its monotony. My manager, a perpetually worried woman named Cheryl, would always give me the same parting words. "Be careful tonight, Mark. You never know who might come through that door." I'd always smile and nod, dismissing it as needless anxiety. I thought I could handle anything. The night it happened was oppressively still and quiet, even for a Tuesday. It was around 2:30 a.m., that dead zone when the world seems to hold its breath, waiting for the dawn. The store was empty, bathed in the humming, clinical glow of the fluorescent lights. The only sound was the low buzz of the drink cooler. Was at the counter, cashing out the register, a nightly ritual that signaled the beginning of the end of my shift. The neat stacks of bills felt crisp and real in my hands, a tangible reward for another night of solitude. I had just finished counting the last of the fives when the front door flew open with such explosive force that it slammed against the wall, the bell above it shrieking in protest. Before I could even look up, a man was inside, moving with a desperate, frantic energy. He was a wreck. His clothes were filthy and torn, his hair was a matted mess, and his eyes were wide, wild, and ringed with a dark, sleepless exhaustion. He carried with him the sour, acrid smell of unwashed bodies and cheap liquor. He didn't say a word. His eyes, burning with a feverish intensity, locked onto the cash in my hands. In that split second, everything slowed down. My training, the little corporate videos about compliance and safety, screamed in my head, "Give him the money. Don't be a hero." But I was frozen, a deer in the headlights, my brain struggling to catch up with the sudden, violent intrusion into my quiet world. He lunged. It wasn't a calculated move. It was the desperate, clumsy pounce of an animal. He snatched the wad of cash from my grasp, his rough fingers scraping against mine. It happened so fast. One moment the money was there, the next it was gone, and he was already stumbling back toward the door. That's when something snapped inside me. It wasn't bravery. It was a hot, indignant surge of adrenaline. It was my shift, my store, and this wreck of a human being wasn't going to just walk out with the night's earnings. All thoughts of safety evaporated. I vaulted over the counter, a clumsy move that almost sent a display of lottery tickets flying, and sprinted out the door after him. "Hey, stop!" I yelled, my voice cracking with a mixture of fear and fury. He was staggering across the empty, brightly lit parking lot, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He was clearly high or drunk, or both. I could see the stolen cash clutched in his fist, a few bills fluttering away in the slight breeze. He wasn't fast. He kept tripping over his own feet. I was gaining on him. "Stop right there," I shouted again. He glanced back, his face a mask of pure animal panic. He tried to run faster, but his body betrayed him. I closed the distance and, without thinking about the consequences, I grabbed him by the collar of his filthy jacket. He spun around, trying to shake me off, his breath a foul wave of stale alcohol. We wrestled for a moment, a clumsy, pathetic dance under the harsh glare of the parking lot lights. He was stronger than he looked, wiry and desperate. He broke my grip and started running again, not toward the highway, but into the darkness behind the station, toward the unlit access road that led to a stretch of woods. My heart was a drum against my ribs, but I wasn't giving up. I fumbled for my phone, my hand shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. I managed to dial 911 and gasped out the situation to the operator. "Robbery in progress. Man fleeing on foot behind the gas and go." They assured me officers were on the way. I didn't chase him into the darkness. A sliver of self-preservation had finally kicked in. Instead, I followed from a distance, using the sound of him crashing through the underbrush to track his movement. I stayed on the edge of the parking lot, keeping him in my line of sight as he stumbled through the tall weeds. He seemed to have forgotten about me, his entire focus on escaping into the perceived safety of the woods. Then, in the distance, I heard it, the faint, rising wail of a police siren. He heard it too. He stopped dead, his whole body going rigid. He was caught between the woods and the approaching lights. I held my breath, staying back, not wanting to spook him into doing something even more reckless. Within seconds, 2 patrol cars screeched into the parking lot, their red and blue lights painting the entire scene in a frantic strobing chaos. 2 officers burst out, guns drawn. "Police, get on the ground now," they yelled, their voices booming in the night air. The man hesitated, for a heartbeat, his wild eyes darting from the cops to the woods, a cornered animal with nowhere to run. Then, with a sigh of utter defeat, he slowly sank to his knees, placing his hands on top of his head. The officers moved in, cuffing him with a swift, practiced efficiency. They found the crumpled cash stuffed in his jacket pocket. One of them walked over to me, his expression a mixture of concern and mild annoyance. "You okay, son? You shouldn't have chased him." I nodded, still trying to catch my breath, the adrenaline starting to recede, leaving a shaky, hollow feeling in its place. I explained what happened, my voice trembling slightly. They confirmed my suspicions. The man was a local homeless addict, well known to them, driven by a desperation I couldn't begin to fathom. I watched them lead him to the back of a squad car. He didn't resist. He just looked small and broken, his head hung in shame. A part of me felt a pang of pity for him, for a life so broken that a clumsy gas station robbery seemed like a viable option. But mostly I just felt a profound relief that it was over. After the police left and the night returned to its usual quiet, the gas station felt different. It was no longer a place of boring solitude. It was a place of vulnerability. The glass doors that I had always seen as a barrier now seemed flimsy and inadequate. My shift ended, but I didn't feel the usual rush of freedom. I felt exposed, fragile. As I drove home through the deserted streets, the image of the man's desperate, panicked face was burned into my mind. I thought about Cheryl's warnings, about how quickly my safe, predictable world had been upended. But the real horror of the story didn't come until the next day. One of the officers called me to follow up. "You're a lucky kid, you know that," he said. "The guy you chased, we ran his prints. He wasn't just some local addict, he'd skipped parole. He was wanted for questioning in a double homicide in the next state over. They think he killed a couple in their home during a robbery 2 weeks ago." The phone felt slick with sweat in my hand. My blood ran cold. I thought back to the chase, to me grabbing his jacket, to our clumsy wrestling match in the parking lot. I had chased him. I had put my hands on him. I had followed him into the darkness. I wasn't just lucky I didn't get hurt. I was lucky to be alive. That night, I wasn't a hero who stopped a simple robbery. I was a fool who danced with a killer and, by some miracle, didn't have to pay for the song. The gas and go is just a memory now, but the chill of that realization has never left me. The plan was simple, a classic college kid escape, a weekend camping trip. Just me, my boyfriend Devin, and our best friends, Bethany and Seth. We were desperate to wash away the stress of a brutal semester under a canopy of stars, to trade the drone of lecture halls for the crackle of a campfire. As we loaded up Devin's car, the mood was electric, a giddy anticipation for ghost stories and burnt marshmallows. But as we drove deeper into the mountains that Friday night, a strange and subtle wrongness began to creep in. The road grew narrow and winding, a black ribbon unfurling through a forest that seemed too dark, too dense. The trees, ancient and monolithic, loomed over the road, their branches knitting together overhead, blocking out the moonlight and creating a tunnel of near-total blackness. The air itself felt heavy, charged. I tried to dismiss the growing knot of dread in my stomach as pre-trip jitters, forcing a laugh at one of Seth's bad jokes. Devin had the radio cranked up, our favorite songs, a flimsy shield against the oppressive silence of the woods. It happened in a heartbeat. A sharp, unsignaled curve appeared out of the darkness. Devin, his reflexes dulled by the long drive, yanked the wheel. The tires screamed in protest on the slick leaf-strewn asphalt. The familiar world dissolved into a sickening, chaotic spin. I remember the lurch of the car as it left the road, the violent crunch of metal against wood. Bethany's terrified scream cut short, and then a sudden, crushing impact that plunged everything into an absolute, silent black. The next thing I knew, I was standing on the side of the road, the cool night air on my skin. Everything was strangely muted, as if I were listening to the world through a thick wall of glass. Devin was beside me. On my other side stood Bethany, her face a pale luminous mask in the gloom, and Seth, his mouth slightly agape. No one was hurt, no one had a scratch. "Is everyone okay?" I asked, but my voice sounded distant, disconnected from me. Bethany gave a slow, jerky nod, her eyes wide and unfocused. Seth just stared, his gaze fixed on the scene before us. I turned to see what held him so captivated, and a wave of icy, incomprehensible horror washed over me. There, crumpled against the unyielding trunk of a massive oak tree, was Devin's car. The front end was completely smashed in, steam hissing from the mangled engine like a dying breath. And inside, still strapped into the seats, were our bodies. I could see myself slumped against the passenger side window, a dark trickle of blood running from a gash on my forehead. my expression vacant. I saw Devon, his head thrown back against the headrest, his hands still locked in a death grip on the steering wheel. In the back, Bethany and Seth were twisted in unnatural positions, pale and terrifyingly still. "We're outside the car," Bethany whispered, her voice trembling. "But we're still in there." The world tilted on its axis. My mind, scrabbling for a rational explanation, found none. This was impossible, a paradox that reality shouldn't allow. I reached out a trembling hand to touch the cold, twisted metal of the car door, but my fingers passed right through it, meeting no resistance, only a faint, tingling cold. I was a ghost. We were all ghosts. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my days. "Are we dead?" Seth finally choked out, the question hanging in the dead air like a death sentence. I couldn't answer, I didn't want to. To give voice to the thought would be to make it real. The forest around us seemed to lean in, the shadows deepening. The trees no longer just trees, but silent, watchful witnesses. The air grew thick with a palpable malevolence, a sense of being observed by something ancient and hungry that resided in the heart of this dark wood. I tried to run, to put distance between myself and the horrific tableau of our own bodies, but my feet felt leaden, rooted to the spot as if the very ground was holding us captive. We were tethered to our broken bodies, to the sight of our own demise. Time ceased to have meaning. We stood there for an hour, or maybe it was an eternity, trapped in a horrific loop of staring at our own mortality. The forest was not silent anymore. Faint whispers seemed to slither through the trees, just at the edge of hearing, unintelligible but filled with a chilling, mocking amusement. Shapes seemed to move in the peripheral darkness, things that were darker than the shadows themselves. I could feel a pull, a gentle but insistent tugging sensation, as if something was trying to draw us away from the car, deeper into the woods, into the waiting darkness. It felt like the forest itself wanted to claim us, to absorb our lost, confused spirits into its ancient, dark heart. Bethany began to weep, silent, spectral tears tracing paths down her pale face. Seth was shaking uncontrollably, his eyes darting into the woods, seeing the same flitting shadows that I did. A profound, soul-crushing despair began to settle over me. This was it. This was our eternity, to be trapped as confused, terrified specters in this malevolent patch of woods, slowly being drawn into whatever abyss awaited us in the dark. The pulling sensation grew stronger. My vision started to blur at the edges, the scene of the crash fading as if I were looking through the wrong end of a telescope. The whispering grew louder, closer. I felt a profound dizziness, a sense of being unmade, dissolved. I closed my eyes, ready for the end. And then, I was ripped away by a violent, blinding light. The whisper of the forest was replaced by the frantic, rhythmic beeping of a machine. My eyes flew open. The light was harsh, fluorescent. The smell was not pine and damp earth, but antiseptic and rubbing alcohol. I was in a hospital bed. I turned my head, a sharp pain shooting through my neck. Devon was in the bed next to mine, his eyes fluttering open. Across the room I could see Bethany and Seth, both hooked up to 4 drips, their faces bruised but their chests rising and falling with the steady rhythm of life. A nurse bustled in, her face a beacon of calm professionalism. "Welcome back, you 4, she said with a warm smile. "You gave us quite a scare. Nasty accident. You've all been unconscious for the better part of 2 days, but you're going to be okay. You're very, very lucky." Lucky. The word felt hollow, meaningless. I looked at my friends. Bethany was staring back at me, her eyes filled with the same haunted, questioning terror that I felt. Seth was silent, but the look on his face was one of someone who has stared into the void and seen it stare back. We were alive. It should have been a moment of pure, unadulterated relief, but it wasn't. The experience, the feeling of being a disembodied spirit, the malevolent presence in the woods, the whispers, it had all felt too real, too vivid to be a mere trauma-induced hallucination. A shared nightmare. As I lay there, listening to the comforting, life-affirming beeps of the heart monitor, I felt a sudden ice-cold chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. I glanced down at my arm, where a nurse had taped down my foreline, and there, on my skin, just next to the tape, were 3 long, faint scratches, angry and red against my pale skin, as if a branch had scraped me. But I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that they hadn't come from a branch. They had been a warning. We had been on the threshold, in the space between worlds, and something had reached out for us from the other side. We had escaped, but I couldn't shake the terrifying feeling that we hadn't come back alone. The heat wave had been holding the city hostage for a week, a suffocating blanket of humid, stagnant air that made every breath feel like a chore. I was on the last leg of my pizza delivery shift, my shirt a damp, second skin, my car's air conditioner, fighting a losing battle. All I wanted was to drop off this last pizza, go home and stand under a cold shower for an hour. My throat was a dessert and my bladder was screaming for attention, a painful, urgent pressure that had been building for the last hour. I was miserable. I pulled up to the address, and my misery was immediately joined by a creeping sense of unease. The house was a dark, hulking shape at the end of a poorly lit street. It looked derelict, forgotten. The paint was peeling in long, leprous strips. The windows were grimy and dark, and the lawn was a tangled jungle of weeds. No lights were on, not a single one. It was the kind of house that kids dare each other to run up and touch. I grabbed the pizza box. The warmth of the cardboard, a strange contrast to the cold dread trickling down my spine. The silence was the most unnerving part. The usual nighttime chorus of crickets and distant traffic was completely absent. The air was dead. I walked up the cracked concrete path and rang the doorbell. The button felt loose and gritty under my finger. I waited nothing. I rang it again, leaning on it longer this time, the shrill, electronic chime sounding ridiculously loud in the oppressive quiet. Still no answer. This was the last thing I needed. I pulled out my phone, my fingers slick with sweat, and dialed the number from the order slip. After several rings, a woman answered. Her voice was shaky, breathless. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, her words tumbling over each other. "Something came up. I'm on my way back. Please, can you just wait a few minutes? Please." There was a frantic, pleading edge to her voice, a hidden current of panic that set my teeth on edge. Yeah, okay," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'll wait." But my bladder was staging a full-scale rebellion. I couldn't wait. I scanned the dark street. There were no neighbors in sight, no cars passing by. The houses next door were just as dark and silent. My eyes landed on a large overgrown azalea bush near the corner of the porch. It was thick and deep, a perfect pocket of shadow. It wasn't ideal, but I was desperate. Glancing around one last time to ensure I was alone, I slipped over to the bush, unzipped my pants, and let go. The relief was immediate, a blissful release of agonizing pressure. I closed my eyes for a second, savoring the moment. And then I heard a rustle. It wasn't the sound of leaves in the wind. It was right in front of me, in the very bush I was currently defiling. My eyes snapped open. My heart skipped a beat. A shape was moving in the foliage. I saw a flash of fabric, the curve of a shoulder. My stream of urine, to my absolute horror, was hitting something solid. Someone was in the bush, a person. I had just peed on a person. I stumbled back, fumbling frantically with my zipper, my mind a chaotic whirl of embarrassment and confusion. A figure erupted from the bush. It was a man. He shot up, sputtering, and without a single glance in my direction. He bolted. He ran with the desperate, wild-eyed terror of a man whose life depended on it, sprinting down the street and disappearing into the night. He was gone in seconds. I stood there, frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs, the pizza forgotten. In my other hand, who was he? What in God's name was he doing hiding in a bush at a deserted house? My flashlight beam from my phone cut through the darkness. My eyes were drawn to the spot where he had been crouching. Something was there, half hidden by the leaves, a bag. My hand shook as I reached down and pulled it out. It was a small, black backpack. My fingers trembled as I unzipped the main compartment. My stomach dropped, and the breath caught in my throat. Inside was a roll of silver duct tape, a coil of thick rope, and a hunting knife with a long serrated blade. A cold, sickening realization washed over me. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't some homeless guy looking for a place to sleep. This was a predator's toolkit. The man hiding in the bushes, the man I had just accidentally hosed down, was waiting for someone. He was planning something monstrous. My fingers, now numb and clumsy, dialed 911. I could barely get the words out, stammering my location, trying to explain the man, the bag, the creepy house. The operator's calm, professional voice was a lifeline in my sea of panic. She told me officers were on their way. As I hung up, headlights swept across the end of the street. A car was approaching, but it wasn't a police car. A woman got out and started walking quickly toward the house, her silhouette small and vulnerable. In the darkness, she kept looking over her shoulder as if she were being followed. It was her, the customer, the woman from the phone. When she saw me standing in the yard, she broke into a run, her face a mask of pure terror. "You have to help me," she cried as she reached me, her voice ragged with sobs. "He's after me, my excusable. He said he'd find me. He said he would finish it tonight." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The empty house was a trap. She was being lured here. The man in the bush was her ex. My accidental, desperate bathroom break had interrupted an ambush, a potential kidnapping or murder. "Get in my car. Now," I said, my own voice sounding surprisingly calm. I grabbed her arm and practically dragged her to my beat-up sedan, shoving her into the passenger seat and locking the doors. We sat there in the dark, windows up despite the suffocating heat. My eyes scanning the shadows, my heart pounding in time with her terrified sobs. Every flicker of a leaf, every distant sound, made us both jump. Minutes later, the street exploded in a wash of red and blue flashing lights. The police had arrived. I explained everything again, my hands shaking as I handed them the backpack. They took the woman's statement, her story tumbling out between gasps and tears. They searched the area, but the man was long gone, swallowed by the night. One of the officers came back to my car. "You did good, kid," he said, his face grim. "We found the back door jimmied open. Looks like he was waiting inside for her, but she was late. He must have gotten impatient and decided to set up an ambush in the yard instead. He paused, looking at me. Your timing, it's a damn miracle. You probably saved her life tonight. I drove home in a daze, the officer's words echoing in my ears. A miracle. I thought about the chain of events, the brutal heat wave, my agonizingly full bladder, my complete lack of shame. It was a random, mundane, slightly gross series of coincidences, but they had aligned perfectly to put me in that exact spot at that exact moment. I saved her life by having to pee. The thought was both absurd and terrifying. I couldn't stop picturing the tools in that bag, couldn't stop thinking about what would have happened if I had been able to hold it for just 5 more minutes. The chill that ran down my spine had nothing to do with the night air. It was the chilling realization of how thin the veil is between a normal, boring night and an absolute nightmare, and how sometimes the most mundane human needs can be the only thing that holds the darkness at bay. There are places in every town that belong more to stories than to the physical world. The old Blackwood house, perched on a lonely hill overlooking our town, was one of those places. It was a skeletal wreck, a monument to decay, with a reputation, as dark and tangled as the thorny vines that clawed at its rotting walls. The stories were the usual stuff of local legend: murders, suicides, a family gone mad. As teenagers, my best friend Kevin and I saw these stories not as warnings but as invitations. We were drawn to the house's dark mystique, convinced that exploring it would be the ultimate thrill, a badge of honor in our boring suburban lives. We didn't believe in ghosts. We were wrong. On a moonless autumn night, we made the pilgrimage. The air was crisp and smelled of dying leaves. As we left the manicured lawns of our neighborhood behind and started up the overgrown path to the house, a palpable sense of transition occurred. The world grew quieter, the air colder. The house loomed at the top of the hill, a jagged silhouette against the star-dusted sky. Even from a distance, it radiated a profound sense of melancholy and menace. Ready for this? Kevin asked, his voice betraying a hint of bravado that didn't quite mask his nerves. I nodded, though a knot of inexplicable dread was tightening in my stomach. This felt less like an adventure and more like a trespass. The rusted iron gate groaned in protest as we pushed it open. The front yard was a cemetery of dead trees and waist-high weeds. The house itself was even more decrepit up close. Windows gaped like vacant eyes, and the front door hung askew on a single, groaning hinge. We pushed it open and stepped inside. The air that hit us was thick, stale and cold, carrying the smell of damp earth, dust, and something else, something faintly metallic and unpleasant, like old blood. The silence within was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to absorb all sound. Our flashlight beams cut through the gloom, revealing a scene of utter dereliction. Furniture lay overturned and shattered, draped in cobwebs as thick as cotton. A grand staircase, its banister rotted away, ascended into the oppressive darkness of the second floor. Kevin, ever the leader, forged ahead, his footsteps crunching on a carpet of fallen plaster and debris. "See, just an old, busted-up house," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the cavernous space. I stayed close behind, my eyes darting into every dark corner, the feeling of being watched growing with every step we took. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a certainty. We were not alone. As we moved from the foyer into what might have been a living room, I heard it, a faint, scratching sound coming from the wall to my left. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Kevin stopped. "Hear what? It's just rats, man." But it didn't sound like rats. It was a slow, deliberate scraping, as if someone were dragging a fingernail along the other side of the wallpaper. We ignored it and pressed on, moving deeper into the house's dark heart. The temperature continued to drop, our breath misting in front of us. We entered a dining room where a long table stood covered in a thick layer of dust, with a single, dust-free spot in the center, as if something had been recently sitting there. The feeling of wrongness was becoming overwhelming. Then we reached the bottom of the main staircase. Kevin, with his typical reckless grin, pointed upward. "Let's check out the upstairs." A wave of pure, primal fear washed over me. "Kev, maybe we should just go," I pleaded, my voice barely a whisper. "This place feels wrong," but he just laughed it off. "Don't be a baby." He was already halfway up the creaking, groaning stairs, with a deep sense of foreboding. I followed. The second floor was a labyrinth of dark hallways and closed doors. The air up here was even colder, and the foul, rotten smell was stronger. It seemed to be emanating from the end of the main hall, from behind a heavy, closed wooden door. As we walked toward it, we heard another sound. It started as a low rumble, a vibration I felt more in my teeth than in my ears. Then it coalesced into a deep, guttural growl. It was not the sound of any animal I had ever heard. It was a sound of pure, ancient hatred. Kevin froze, his bravado finally dissolving into naked fear. The growl was coming from behind that door. "We need to go," I whispered urgently, my voice shaking. "Now, Kevin." But he was transfixed, caught between terror and a morbid curiosity. He took a hesitant step toward the door. It's probably just the wind in the pipes or something," he stammered. though his pale face told me he didn't believe it for a second. As his hand reached for the tarnished brass doorknob, the growling intensified, rising in pitch and volume. A snarling, menacing chorus of rage. My heart felt like it was going to explode. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed. My feet welded to the floor. Gavin slowly, inexorably pushed the door open. The room beyond was pitch black. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a shadow in the far corner detached itself from the deeper shadows around it. It was a figure, vaguely humanoid, but horribly wrong. It was hunched and twisted, its limbs too long, its proportions nightmarish. As it straightened up, I could see 2 points of dim red light ignite in the space where its eyes should be, glowing like embers in the dark. The growling stopped. The figure was utterly still, and then it spoke. Its voice was not a sound, but a feeling, a dry, sibilant whisper that seemed to slither directly into our brains. Leave or never leave again. The words were a physical blow. They were not a threat. They were a statement of fact, a promise. We didn't wait for a second invitation. We turned and fled. We scrambled down the hallway, the house seeming to come alive around us. Doors slammed shut in the corridor behind us. A cold, spectral wind howled through the halls. The walls themselves seemed to groan and shift. We half fell, half tumbled down the main staircase, the wood splintering under our feet. We sprinted for the front door, the air behind us feeling thick and cold, as if something was reaching for us, its icy fingers just inches from our backs. We burst out into the night air, gasping and sobbing, and we didn't stop running until the Blackwood house was just a dark smudge on the horizon. We never spoke of what we saw or heard in that house. It was a secret we buried deep, a shared trauma that we couldn't articulate. We tried to convince ourselves it was our minds playing tricks on us, but a week later, I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in a cold sweat. There was a tapping at my bedroom window. I told myself it was a tree branch, but there are no trees near my window. The tapping continued, slow and rhythmic. Then, I heard a faint, dry whisper ride the wind, the same voice from the house. You left, it hissed, but you did not leave alone. I know now that the house's warning wasn't just about its own physical walls. It was a warning that once you've looked into that kind of darkness, a piece of it looks back, and sometimes it follows you home.